Welcome everyone to Agile Talks by Agile Gurus. I'm your host Rahul Kataria, and today on our show we have Awais Sheikh and Reha Malik. Hey guys.
Hello.
Hello.
How are you guys?
Good.
Good. Awesome. So guys, today we're going to talk about user stories. This would be a three-part podcast. For next 3 weeks, we're going to be talking about user stories, and we're going to try to get in as much detail and depth as we can over this 30-minute podcast every week. So today we're going to focus more on what are user story, what constructs a user story, and how to write good user stories and some examples. And then in the second part, we're going to talk about more about estimations and how to do estimate, what are estimates. And then we're going to keep talking as the questions come in. So if you guys do have any questions for the live audience, if you guys have any questions, feel free to put in the chat column and then we'll try to answer as we go. So I'm going to start with Reha. Reha, what are user stories? How do you define them? And what do you think of user stories?
So Rahul, at the very core, I think a user story would describe something that the user wants to accomplish by using whatever product you're trying to build, right? User stories originated as part of the Agile and the Scrum development strategies. But for designers, they're going to mainly serve as reminders of user goals and a way to organize and prioritize how the product is going to be designed and developed. A user story should be very short, something very short, about 1 sentence long. In fact, a simple template of a user story would be, as a user, I want to, and then just a pen with the basic user goal. What are you trying to accomplish, right? And because these stories are so typically so short and specific, it's going to take you a lot of user stories to cover every possible use case. So for example, if you were to start writing user stories, it would begin with something like, as a user, I want to create a new account, right? But then you should start thinking what really involves in creating the new account. The user would need to supply a username, a password, any other pertinent information. And then each individual action would need a corresponding user story. And the more specific each story is, the easier things will be later for the designers and developers. So essentially, if we were to use that same example of, as a user, I want to create an account, it could actually be further broken down into, as a user, I want to type the username. As a user, I want to enter a password. As a user, I want to re-enter my password to verify it. As a user, I want to submit this information and create an account, etc. And if done properly, the end result will be a long set of user stories, and that's what the intent is. User stories should be testable, right? They should be something very small, and they should be delivering against a user requirement. And the key is to focus on a value delivery here and not on an artifact creation, because I think a lot of teams and a lot of Agile teams, essentially, they focus on artifact creation. So what do I mean by that? Let's use an example. An artifact creation would say, as a user, I'd like a login page so I can log in, right? And the acceptance criteria would be something like, I can log in and I have a forgot password link. If you were to not focus on artifact creation, but to focus on capability, the user story would be, as a registered user who forgot the password, I'd like to be able to provide my email and have a password reminder sent to me. So essentially, a good user story should be independent, negotiable, valuable, estimable, small, and testable, which is the invest model. I'm not going to go too much into it. Probably later on during the session, if there are folks who want to hear more, we can talk about the invest model more. But essentially, in my opinion, that's what a user story is.
So the user story is not just an artifact, but it's more about the functionality that it delivers, right? It's
Absolutely.
the value that the customers or whoever is getting out of it.
Absolutely.
Good.
The focus is value delivery here.
Yeah. So you mentioned something about requirements, right? It's not just a requirement. It's more of the value delivery. So Awais, I'm gonna ask you this question. What's the difference between user stories and requirements, I guess, from like the traditional world we used to have?
Yeah, I think this is very important to understand because a lot of like business analysts, transitioning into a role of a product owner and then later on a product manager. and they're very much used to writing huge requirements like BRDs and FRDs and all of those things which used to happen back in the day. The major difference is the objective with which you write the user story, right? The key difference is within a requirement, you'll focus on what is the system, how it is behaving, and what it is supposed to do. Whereas within user stories, we need to focus on the user perspective. So just to dwell into that a bit, into detail. And Ray had a good example, very brief about authorization and authentication. So when it comes to requirement, it would be detailed all the different things. But when we trim it down to a user story, it would be like, as a user, I want to be able to reset my password so that I can get back into the system if I forget it.
Yeah.
Again, the persona of the entire user story is written from a user perspective, taking into account the persona of the user. So initially, when the designers start creating the user stories, they think about the user, what the user is, how the user is using the system, what is the user, different personas, how the user would behave, how the user would interact with the system. So it is very much focused from a user perspective rather than functionality of how the system would behave.
Got you. Yeah. So, very good point that you brought up, Ways. A lot of times, I've seen people writing stories, especially who are new to this. They write stories in a form of, as a product owner, this is what I want, right? Mm-hmm. And a lot of people are either completely opposed to this. Because they were like, the story is not for the product owner, it's for the user. Like, if, for example, like the ones that you just gave us, either like a back office agent getting value out of it, or like an end customer getting the value out of it, right? So what thoughts do you or Reha, if you have, on this topic?
I think you're exactly on point, Rahul. It should be from a perspective of a user. And when we build the system, right, we have, I'm glad you took that example, back office. So within our organization, we already have a persona, back office Betty. So Betty is the back office person who is doing the payments, making sure that the bills are in place. So from a system perspective, right, rather than thinking what the system is supposed to do, we think from a perspective of Betty. How does Betty uses the system, right? Yeah. That is where we go into as instead of as a user, as Betty, I go to the back end of the system and I pay my bills, right? Pay the payment of invoices. And there is the huge, because as soon as we start into the conversation of as a product owner, then it comes as a developer, I want this, as a DBA, I want this, but we need to get away from the mindset of who is building the system to who is consuming the system.
Yeah, absolutely. And I completely agree with you. Rhea, do you have any comments on this?
I would just go back to the name, right? The name is a user story. So it's the story from a user's perspective. And I think that's what we need to do. And Awais raised a great point about the requirements, right? A lot of times people think that a user story is everything. User stories, which are several pages long, it's not a documentation of a requirement. User stories are placeholders for communication. They are things which should start the communication around value delivery, right? It should be a simple representation of the requirement, and it should contain very high-level description of the customer valued functionality, right? You can have artifacts, you can have requirement documents, you could have wireframes, you can have workflow documents, and all those artifacts are appended on an as-need basis to the user story. So user story is not a requirement. It is the story of the user.
Yep, love that. Thank you again for both of you. All right, so I'm gonna switch the topic a little bit. You talked about invest model, right? And so, Awais, what are your thoughts on it? How can you write a good user story? What exactly is a good user story? Can you explain a little bit more?
Yeah, so I think MicCon, if you don't get detail into it, and for anyone listening to the podcast, like MicCon has a wonderful book around it, uh, and he goes way too much into detail about the invest model. But just to think at a high level, the story should be independent, negotiable. It should add value on its own. Obviously, it should be estimatable, small and testable, right? That's invest model, like in a crux. Now, whenever we look at a user story, so this is where Scrum Master could come in, the developers would come in. Think from a perspective of hey, can I measure the effort of that, right? Is the story small enough? And we see a lot of people going into having development stories, having QA stories. Then we need to ask, is this story independent enough, right? Obviously, we need to have there are dependencies and things like that, right? But can a user story by itself stand alone, right? There would be a lot of different cases wherein obviously we have dependencies on the user story and the functionalities being completed, and that's perfectly fine. But the moment we get into a UI focused story, a backend focused story, a middleware focused story, that's where we have lost the model. So for the folks on the call and whoever listening, anytime you see a user story, just see, is it is it investable, right? Is it independent? Is it providing value by itself? Can the user story stand alone by itself? And a great parameter is, can a layman understand it, right? Can you explain to a 5-year-old that this is the user story, and can a 5-year-old really get it that this is a user story? If you can achieve that, that's that's really the benchmark that we have within our teams. While coaching product owners, while coaching product managers, that stories have to be so simpler at this level that you can actually explain it to a 5-year-old.
Yeah. And great point you brought up about, I have definitely seen in my experience a lot of people creating UI stories, database stories, and like certain different like middleware backend stories. I honestly don't know. Like I have seen places where it was applicable, but I'm still like a huge fan of having stories vertically sliced, which that's the big word around stories, vertical slicing, right? Like a cake. So have all the functionalities covered, so it can actually deliver some value at the end of the day. All right, perfect. So thank you, Awais, for that. Invest model, we talked about that. So Reha, talking about stories, and I think there's a question that might relate to it. Our next question that we had was story versus tasks, right? What's the difference between stories and tasks? What exactly is a task? And then I don't know if this question will relate to it from our live audience. If the user story is not detailed, how would the developer convert the user story into product functionality? Wouldn't it create some gaps?
So I'll answer the second part of your question first, and then we'll move into the task versus stories definition. So no, the user story should not be detailed. And the reason we say that is because user stories are essentially placeholders for communication. Traditionally, when we were in the waterfall model, we would have detailed set of requirements, and the developers would take those requirements and essentially go and develop against those requirements. So it was a phase-gated approach, right? And we would assume that narrow set, if you were to think about the cone of uncertainty, we would fix our requirements very early into the process, and we would assume that that is the word of God and move forward with that assumption. What we are trying to do with the user story approach is to create placeholders. So we know what value we are trying to deliver as part of the story, and the intent is for it to be negotiable. That's a piece of the invest model. And what negotiable essentially means is that the story should be brief enough because it's not a detailed contract. The purpose is to encourage an ongoing conversation and scope negotiation between the customer and the developers. So the intent is that you design the story and you test the story to consider what user value we are trying to achieve. That's the end objective. And that is why it should not be detailed. Because if you detail it and you lock the how in the user story very early on, then you are letting go of the whole agile. The word agile means flexible. So you're letting go of the flexibility, you're fixing detailed requirements very early into the process, and therefore just losing the entire agility in the process. Okay?
Yep.
So that's my take on it. For the second part of the question around user stories and tasks, just to let the listeners know, when we refer to tasks, it's about a type of how you would log an item in a tool like Jira or Rally or version 1, right? So we've got a story type, and then we've got a task type, and we've got spikes or refactors. We've got these fancy things. And a lot of times the question is, when do I use one over the other? I always tell teams to use the user stories to when they are delivering value to the customer. Right? So this is end value being delivered to the customer. So think from a business perspective. What am I trying to achieve and how am I trying to achieve it? So that would constitute of a user story. When you think about tasks, these are non-functional requirements. So these are not delivering essentially direct value to the customer, but these are going to be required to either continue delivering value or to enable the teams to start delivering value in the future. So think of Oracle upgrades, your server upgrades, refactors. All of these would actually be tasks. Okay.
Yeah.
And then there's a third type. A lot of times we notice that user stories become very detailed, very big. They are ambiguous in nature. And that is because the what is not very clear, or the design is not very clear. And we're very early into the design and the strategy and the prototyping phases. That is when I highly suggest teams to use spikes, research spikes instead of using a user story or a task, because that is when you have a lot of unknowns, right? So you should use these different types available because it matters what you're logging things as. So that's the difference between a story, a task, and a spike.
Perfect. Thank you. So, okay. You brought up very, very great points. Now, this is how I used to define, and I think I still define user story or difference between stories and tasks, right? I think user stories are a what, and the tasks are the how to deliver that what, right? And that's where when I've seen a lot of product owners when they start writing user stories for the team, even before it's groomed with the team, they start putting all the hows in, like how do you want them to deliver it, right? That. And we have another topic after this is the anti-patterns. I think that falls into that. So at least for me, the big difference is, discuss how or what needs to be delivered and then let the team groom it how they need to deliver it. Like those small tasks, like getting approval from someone, that becomes a task, or creating an Excel sheet or whatever, that becomes a task to deliver the story.
You bring up a good point, Rahul, because yes, essentially, and it really depends on what you're logging as. In some tools, I do want to, for our listeners, when you refer to tasks, they're also called subtasks. They're one level below the user story level. So those are the subtasks, which are, like you suggested, the hows of how to work on a user story. Yeah. But also in some tools, at the same level as the user stories, you will find spikes and you will find tasks.
Right.
That is when you would distinguish functional requirements from non-functional requirements, right? And the hows would be tasks in that.
Yeah, and I think it goes back to, I guess, Jira. I've seen Jira version 1, they use different terminology, right? Like I think one of them uses features and other one uses sub-epics or something like that, interchangeable for whatever other terminologies. All right, great. So talking about that, what are some anti-patterns that you guys have seen? Ray, I'm going to start with you.
There are many. I'm going to start with a few I have, and then I'll let Awais, because I know you've got a lot of experience in this area. I did mention one before, and that is when you start thinking that the user story is everything. If you are using Agile or Scrum, many believe that you're supposed to use user stories for everything. Everything you're doing needs to be a user story. That is not true, right? A product backlog item can take any format. It can be in user stories, it can be tasks, it can be spikes, it can be refactors. And then you would have supporting documentation like workflow diagrams, wireframes, design documents, and it's completely okay. So user story is not everything. That's a big anti-pattern I see in a lot of places. The next one I see is when people start confusing acceptance criteria with the definition of done. They are two entirely different things, right? A definition of done is very different from an acceptance criteria. Definition of done, think of it as an auditable quality checklist that would apply to every user story. So it is independent of a user story.
Absolutely.
Every team should have a definition of done, right? It would include things like checking in the code, verifying that unit, integration, system, and acceptance tests have passed, verifying performance and load testing has passed. Whatever gets an item to done would be included in that checklist. Acceptance criteria is going to be unique for every user story. So it's going to ensure that the entire team, including the product owner, have the same understanding of what constitutes as doneness, okay, and the expected quality for the user story. So they're two different things.
Yeah.
And if you do not have a definition of done, I highly recommend you have them. The last one I'm going to mention is not having a definition of ready. Again, it's a third thing, and it's entirely different from a definition of done and an acceptance criteria. Many teams would regularly reach the end of the sprint with a lot of user stories in progress and no product increment, right? They would simply move the user story to the next sprint and then just continue working on them. Some split them up as dev only and test only stories, right?
Yep.
So these are just many of the smells and the anti-patterns which I've observed. You want to ensure that your team creates that definition of ready to set that common understanding on the type of the refinement needed for the user story before you pull it into the sprint or the iteration, right? So the definition of ready would apply to stories before they get pulled into a sprint. So those criteria should be met during your iteration planning or sprint planning. And the definition of done applies to after all the stories have been done, right? So make sure you differentiate between them and they exist.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. And that's where a lot of teams, especially starting out, start failing because, they keep pushing stories to one to second to third sprint because the story essentially was never ready to even start to be started. And we're going to talk about it in our part 3. But Awesh, what are some anti-patterns that you have seen or experienced?
Just taking up on your point, I think one of the major things that I have seen is teams taking on stories that are really too big or too risky within the sprint itself. Right? Yeah. One of the very important criteria for a user story is it has to be, the reason it has to be small is because it has to fit within an iteration.
Yeah.
So what team usually try to do is fit everything in a single user story and then take that user story back home from sprints to sprints and keep on working. That's where the stand-ups become messy. Yesterday I was working on the same thing, I don't know what, and today I'll be working on the same thing. So as soon as you hear that conversation, one of the things as a Scrum Master, you should really pay attention is that, hey, probably these stories are not breaking down, right?
Yeah.
So breaking down the user stories into smaller chunks, providing, enough detail and, enough value that it stands alone by itself. And again, another very big anti-pattern is, then the user stories start, the moment you tell the team that, hey, we need to break it down, they start, some of the, not mature team, they start breaking down from okay, this is the dev part, this is where we'll do testing.
Yeah.
And this is for, architectural updates. So again, we need to think holistically and, have a user story which can really, I know we've been spending too much time on the invest model, but it really provides a very big holistic approach on, how a story can stand alone by itself, in spite of being small, right?
Yeah. Absolutely. And whatever you just said, Awais, I think it's a foundational step for, especially for the new team. So guys, if you guys are a Scrum Master, especially, and you are having, tough times, talking with your team about this, I highly suggest getting a mentor or coach to talk to about this, because once they get into the habit of just splitting stories, not in a good way, that habit sticks. And then that's where you start seeing a lot of failures, a lot of conflicts and issues, like not good conflicts. So yeah, thank you guys for that. We have like 3 questions from our live audience, or actually, Rhea, you answered one, I guess. Where do we draw the line between us being brief and explaining the story to an outsider? Rhea, do you want to take that?
Story should define the what. What are you trying to fulfill? So as a user, what is the action you're trying to perform, right? And then the acceptance criteria should typically be in the GWT syntax. That's what we suggest. That's given, when, then, or at least if you're not following this, it should cover scenarios of what you're trying to accomplish. Again, focus on the how. You should not be defining the what. That you should not be defining the how as part of the acceptance criteria, but the what and the why. Okay, and ensure that you are covering the what and the why as part of the acceptance criteria. And like Awais had suggested, any outsider should be able to come in and see what value you're delivering as part of the user story. It's a conversation starter. So whenever you bring that story to the grooming, the intent is that the developers and the testers and the analysts should be asking questions so that they can better define the how. That should not be defined as part of the story.
Yeah, exactly. And I think I guess the flip side of it is you don't have to like cram all the details in the story so that an outsider can understand. That's not the goal for it. As long as the team is, on point about what that means and what the value is, I think keep it short and simple.
Yeah, I think the problem comes when we start trying to split it up based on functionality, the GUI layer, the schema layer, and so on and so forth. I think that is when we have to take a step and make the user or an outsider understand, right? If you are looking as much as you can to Awais' point, to the invest model and ensuring that you are trying to build small, testable, demoable units of value delivery, I think it's easier to define them that way.
Yeah, and so the next question from the audience is, what to do when the dev and testing team to add too much details in user stories. So I guess I'm not clear if there are different dev and testing teams, or I think they're like maybe different roles, developers and testers. They want to add more details to the user story. So what do we do at that point? Yeah.
Essentially, I tried to answer it there. Every user story, depending on whatever tool you're using, whether you're using Rally or Jira version 1, there is a level below story. So when you go in there, you can create subtasks. Kind of encourage your team to use that. Just be careful of a nuance of subtask. It ends up becoming micromanagement. So be careful of that piece.
Yeah.
Don't try and estimate the subtasks of how many hours is it going to take you. As long as the team is using subtasks to document relevant steps of the how, that is okay. But they should not be adding it to the acceptance criteria or the description area, because that just muddles up that entire process.
Yeah. Awais, do you have any other suggestions or comments on this?
Yeah, I think there's an important point which usually get missed is the story should the framework is to enable conversations, right? So there should be some small ambiguity which enables the conversations between the dev team, between the PO, right? If we have all the details jammed in there, then it's basically a requirement that any person can go in there and develop it. That's not the major purpose. To have that collaboration, that communication going on between the team, you need to keep it short. And I think it's a good model if the team goes in and add details and as to Reha's point, adding subtasks, right? Some of the teams, what they do is they would go in and add subtasks for like unit testing, integration testing.
Right.
That comes from the definition of done, and that's where we like the collaboration is really engaged between different person. And if in the organization, if you're building a product which is into SOX compliance, right, you need to have a different person doing the testing. So that is where people collaborate. We have a couple of devs working in and contributing to a story.
Yeah, no, absolutely right. Rhea, were you going to say something?
No.
Did I cut you off? Got you. Perfect. So yeah, I mean, I have seen teams, I've seen the process where, the team or product owner creates a story, and when they're grooming it, they put like a separate area within the description saying notes. If
Mhm.
just so that, if there are things that they need to remember, or it's people they have to contact, either they add subtask or add more notes. And so I would let the team groom it and
Yeah.
have as much detail as they like to, but I would never like enforce to put every little thing in there. That gets just too much.
Micromanagement, it's kind of a rabbit hole at that point,
Yeah.
because that starts getting really messy after that.
Yeah. And I think, having, getting into a good habit of grooming and making sure the stories are good enough and ready. It takes time, especially if you're a new team, guys. I mean, it takes a while to get to that good habit of grooming it. I remember I've worked with a lot of new teams, and they get frustrated very soon because it takes so long to groom the stories that they thought they knew everything about, right? So if you're a scrum master, product owner, just be patient with the team, and then if you're a team member, absolutely be patient when you're grooming. So Reha and Awais, do you guys have any other comments? This was the last question.
No, I think we covered it all. My only thing would be, I know one of you had posted a comment here that the user story should be high level. Make sure your user story is defining the what and the why. Please ensure that it should not be as high level as, it's very ambiguous, but at the same time, like we've been discussing, not too many details added to it either. Just enough that it sparks the right conversations, and that it kind of tells you what value you are delivering as part of the story. So that would be my.
Absolutely. All right. Thank you, guys. Thank you, Awais, and thank you, Reha, and thank you, everyone, for joining today. This is a recording, so we'll post this on our YouTube channel again, so feel free to check out all the other videos. But the second and third part, in the second part, we'll cover, which is next week, we're going to cover estimation, and I'm very passionate about it, so bear with me next week. And the third week, we're going to talk more about grooming and splitting stories, and what are epics, and how do you split epics into smaller stories, and all those things. So if you guys have any other questions or concerns, or something you want to suggest that we should cover in those two podcasts, feel free to do that. We are also planning to hold a user story writing workshop soon. So if you are interested, feel free to send me an email at rk@myagilegurus.com. And then we'll put you on the list when we ever do that. So thank you, everyone, again. Thank you, Reha. Thank you, Awais. This was fun. Loved it. I will see you guys next week.
Yep. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
See ya.